Margaret Ashford's hands trembled as the 7-foot giant blocking the doorway spoke his first words to her. "You're smaller than I expected. This ranch breaks women twice your size." His voice rumbled like distant thunder, and his eyes cold as Colorado winter assessed her like livestock at auction. She'd traveled 2,000 miles to marry this stranger, signed a contract binding her to him for life, and now realized the advertisement had lied about everything except his need for a wife. There was no going back to New York. Before we continue, please subscribe to our channel and follow this story to the very end. Comment below which city you're watching from. I love seeing how far these tales travel. The stagecoach driver had refused to go further than the base of the mountain, leaving Margaret to climb the final 2 miles alone. Her fine leather boots were ruined, now caked in mud that would never come clean. Somewhere between the second and third switchback, she'd lost her hat pin and nearly lost her nerve. Now she stood face to chest with Jonas Blackwood, and every instinct screamed at her to run. "Mr. Blackwood!" Her voice came out smaller than she'd intended. "Jonas." He didn't move from the doorway, didn't offer to take her bag, didn't smile. "You're the Ashford girl." Margaret Ashford. She forced herself to meet his gaze despite the 1.5 feet between their eyes. "Your letter said to arrive before October. It's September 28th. "Yes." A cold wind cut through her wool coat, and Margaret's teeth wanted to chatter, but she locked her jaw. She'd be damned if she'd show weakness in the first 5 minutes. "You planning to invite me inside?" she said. "Or do frontier marriages start with the bride freezing on the porch?" Something flickered across his face, surprise maybe. He stepped back, and she had to turn sideways to squeeze past him into the cabin. 1 room, 1 bed, 1 table. 1 man who looked like he could snap her spine without effort. Margaret set down her carpetbag and turned to face him. The letters mentioned a daughter. Jonas closed the door. The sound was final as a coffin lid. "No daughter, no wife before you. Mrs. Henderson in town wrote those letters for me. She embellished." The floor seemed to tilt. "You lied." "Mrs. Henderson lied. I wrote to correct it, sent a letter to New York offering to pay your return fare." His expression could have been carved from granite. "You didn't receive it." "I'd already left." Margaret's voice came out flat. "Gave up my room, said my goodbyes, burned every bridge." "Then you didn't know." "No, I didn't know I was tricked into marrying a man who—" She bit off the words, but Jonas finished them anyway. "Who what? Who needs a lie to get a wife? Who's so goddamn unlovable he has to buy one through the mail?" His voice was still calm, but something dangerous moved behind his eyes. "You think I wanted this? You think I'm proud of advertising for a woman like she's livestock?" Margaret took a step back, then forced herself to step forward again. "Then why did you—" "Because the alternative was dying alone on this mountain, and I got tired of waiting for it." He moved past her to the fireplace, began building the fire with sharp, precise movements. "You're here now. We're legally bound. I'll give you food, shelter, protection, and respect. You'll work the ranch, manage the household, build a life here." He didn't look at her. "I won't force myself on you. The bed is yours. I'll take the floor until you decide otherwise. Could be a week, could be never. That's your choice." Margaret stared at his broad back. "What aren't you telling me?" His hands stilled on the firewood. "What makes you think there's more?" "Because men don't hide on mountaintops for no reason. Because your letters, Mrs. Henderson's letters, never mentioned why you live 3 hours from the nearest town." She moved closer. "Because I just gave up everything for this marriage, and I deserve the complete truth." Jonas stood slowly, turning to face her. For a long moment he just looked at her. Really looked like he was trying to decide something important. "I killed a man in Montana," he said finally. "He was hurting. A woman wouldn't stop, so I stopped him permanently. Law cleared me, said it was defense of another, but his family had money and connections, and they made it clear I'd never be safe there. So I came here where nobody asks questions." Margaret's mouth had gone dry. Did he deserve it? Yes. Then I suppose that's all I need to know for now. Jonas's eyebrows rose a fraction. You're not afraid. I'm terrified. But I've been terrified since I left New York, and fear hasn't killed me yet. Margaret pulled the marriage certificate from her bag, unfolded it. This paper says we're bound together. In New York, I had nothing, 3 sisters at home, a mother working herself to death, and no prospects except a factory job that would have killed me before 30. I came here because I needed a future. She looked up at him. You need to decide right now if you want a wife who asks questions and expects honest answers, or if you want a servant who keeps her mouth shut. Because I can't be both. Something shifted in Jonas's expression. Not quite a smile, but close. You're not what I expected, Margaret Blackwood. Neither are you, Jonas Blackwood. Now are we going to stand here talking, or are you going to feed me? I'm half-starved. That almost smile widened a fraction. There's stew in the pot. Help yourself. Cowboy. They ate in tense silence. The stew was simple but well-made venison, vegetables, herbs she didn't recognize. Margaret's stomach growled audibly, betraying just how hungry she was. How big is the ranch? She asked finally. 300 acres, 50 head of cattle, some horses, chickens, 2 goats. Jonas mopped his bowl with hard bread. We're self-sufficient. Trade in town twice a year for what we can't make. What will I be doing? Everything. Garden, chickens, cooking, preserving, mending. And ranch work when I need extra hands herding, fencing, whatever comes up. He watched her reaction. This isn't a life where women's work and men's work stay separate. Everyone does everything or we fail. Margaret set down her spoon. I don't know how to do most of those things. I'll teach you. What if I can't learn fast enough? Then we starve when winter comes, and they'll find our bodies in spring. He said it without drama, like he was discussing the weather. But you're stubborn enough to learn. I can see it. You don't know anything about me. I know you climbed 2 miles up a mountain in ruined boots and still had enough spine to challenge me on my own doorstep. I know you asked if a man deserved to die before deciding whether to be afraid of me. Jonas leaned back. That's enough to start with. Margaret absorbed this. Then, when do we begin? Tomorrow. Dawn. Don't oversleep. She didn't. Couldn't really. The corn husk mattress rustled with every movement, and her mind wouldn't stop churning. She lay in the darkness, listening to Jonas breathe by the fire, listening to the wind in the pines, listening to her own heartbeat, and wondering what the hell she'd gotten herself into. When gray light finally seeped through the windows, she rose before Jonas could wake her. He emerged from his bedroll to find her already dressed, standing by the cold fireplace. Coffee, he said simply, and showed her how to make it. The stuff tasted like boiled tree bark, but it shocked her system awake. Jonas moved through the morning routine with efficient precision, stoking the fire, pulling on boots, checking the weather through the window. First rule, he said, animals come before people. They can't feed themselves, and if they die, we die. Understood? Understood. Second rule, don't try to do things you haven't been taught. Ask first. Mountains not forgiving of stupid mistakes. And the third rule, Jonas looked at her directly. Don't lie to me. About anything. I don't care if you break something or fail at something or hate it here. I need to know the truth or we can't trust each other. Without trust, we're dead. Margaret nodded slowly. Same goes for you. Fair enough. He opened the door. Let's go. Dad. The barn was warm with animal heat and smelled of hay and manure. 6 horses, 1 milk cow, 2 dozen chickens. Jonas demonstrated feeding procedures with practiced efficiency. Your turn, he said, handing her a grain bucket. Margaret approached the first horse, a gray mare with intelligent eyes. The horse snuffled at her empty hands, and Margaret froze. The animal was enormous up close, powerful enough to kill her with one kick. Move or get out of the way, Jonas said from behind her. Standing still makes them nervous. Margaret poured grain into the trough with shaking hands. The mare immediately plunged her nose into the feed, and Margaret jumped back. Jonas didn't laugh. First time with horses. We didn't have many horses in the tenements. You'll learn. They're easier than people more honest about what they want. After feeding came egg collecting. Margaret reached into a nesting box and nearly screamed when the hen pecked her hand. She's broody, Jonas said. Leave that one, she'll draw blood. Try the next box. By the time they finished the barn, Margaret's hands were shaking from more than cold. Jonas led her to the creek, a 20-minute walk down a steep trail where one wrong step could mean a twisted ankle, or worse. This is our water supply, he said. You'll haul water every day for washing and cooking. 2 trips minimum, 4 in summer. Margaret looked at the creek, then at the steep trail, then back at Jonas. Every day. Every day. With buckets. With buckets. He picked up 2 wooden pails from beside the creek and filled them. Watch how I walk weight-balanced steps careful. Water's heavy. Spill too much and you'll make the trip again. He made it look easy. When Margaret tried, she sloshed water at every step, and by the time they reached the cabin, both buckets were half empty. Again, Jonas said simply. By the 4th trip, Margaret's arms trembled so badly she could barely lift the buckets. Jonas took them from her without comment and hauled the water himself. That's enough for today. We need to eat. Margaret's pride stung. I can do more. No, you can't. You push too hard the first day, you'll hurt yourself and be useless tomorrow. He set the buckets down. This is lesson 3, know your limits. Stubbornness is good. Stupidity will kill you. The rest of the day passed in a blur of new tasks, each one harder than Margaret expected. The garden needed weeding, but Jonas stopped her after 10 minutes. Not that one that's medicinal. Not that either, it's a late vegetable. He pointed. Those are weeds. See the difference? Margaret couldn't, but she nodded anyway. By midday, her back ached and her hands were blistered despite the gloves. They ate beans and bread, and Margaret nearly fell asleep at the table. Rest this afternoon, Jonas said. I need to check the far pastures. Show me what else needs doing. I'd rather learn now. Jonas studied her. You always this stubborn. You always this bossy. That almost smile appeared again. All right, but we pace ourselves. Kill yourself the first week, and you're no good to anyone. He showed her the root cellar, the smokehouse, the workshop. Explained which tools were for what, where supplies were kept, how everything had its place and needed to return there. Margaret's head spun with information, but she forced herself to pay attention. Her life might depend on remembering. Evening came too fast. Jonas butchered venison for dinner, and Margaret watched his knife work with fascination. He moved with absolute confidence, wasting nothing, his massive hands surprisingly deft. You'll learn butchering, he said without looking up. Can't be squeamish about blood on a ranch. I'm not squeamish. We'll see. He glanced at her. City girls usually faint the first time they see slaughter. I watched my father die of drink, Margaret said flatly. Took him 3 days and he vomited blood the whole time. I held the bucket. I think I can handle a dead deer. Jonas's knife stilled. He looked at her for a long moment. I'm sorry. Don't be. He was a bastard. Margaret met his eyes. That's truth like you asked for. My father drank away every penny we had. My mother took in washing until her hands bled. My oldest sister married a man twice her age just to have one less mouth to feed. That's why I'm here, because anything is better than watching my family slowly starve while pretending we're respectable. Silence filled the cabin. Then Jonas returned to his work. My father was worse, he said quietly. Beat my mother until she couldn't stand, then beat her for not standing. When I got big enough, I made him stop. Permanently. Margaret's breath caught. That's not the man you killed in Montana. No, that was years earlier. Different situation. He finished with the venison and carried it to the fire. But it's why I don't drink, and why I don't raise my hand to anyone unless they deserve it. Saw what that kind of man becomes. Swore I'd never be it. They cooked together in silence that felt less hostile now, more contemplative. When they finally sat down to eat, Margaret realized she was too exhausted to be properly hungry. "You did good today," Jonas said. "Better than most would have." The compliment should have pleased her. Instead, Margaret felt tears prick her eyes, exhaustion and stress finally catching up. She blinked them back hard. Jonas pretended not to notice. "Get some sleep. Tomorrow we start again." The pattern repeated. Wake at dawn work until her body screamed, learn new skills, imperfectly collapse into exhausted sleep. But each day Margaret got stronger, faster, more confident. On the third morning she carried both water buckets from the creek without spilling. Jonas nodded approval but said nothing. On the fourth morning she collected eggs without getting pecked, and only one horse made her nervous. On the fifth morning she woke before Jonas shook her shoulder and had coffee brewing when he emerged from his bedroll. "You're adapting," he said. "I'm surviving," Margaret corrected, but she smiled when she said it. That afternoon, Jonas rode out to check fence lines and left Margaret with a list of chores. She worked through them methodically. Chickens fed, eggs collected, garden weeded, water hauled. When he returned at dusk, she had dinner ready, beans seasoned the way he'd taught her, fried potatoes, the last of the fresh carrots. Jonas tasted the beans, nodded. "Good. You're learning." Something warm spread through Margaret's chest at those simple words. That night, after they'd cleaned up, Jonas pulled a worn book from his chest. "Can you read?" he asked. "Yes. Can you?" Slowly. He held out the book, Frontier Tales, pages soft from handling. "If you wanted, you could read aloud sometimes, evenings. It might be pleasant." Margaret took the book, touched by the awkward offer. "I'd like that." So she read while he mended tack, her voice filling the cabin's silence. The stories were simple cowboys and cattle drives, outlaws and sheriffs, but Jonas listened with complete attention. When she finished the first chapter, he looked up from his work. "Your voice is nice," he said. "Better than Mrs. Henderson's. She reads like she's in church." Margaret laughed before she could stop herself. "Should I read more?" "If you're not too tired." She read 2 more chapters, and when she finally closed the book, Jonas was watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "What?" she asked. "Nothing. Just..." He looked away. "It's been a long time since this cabin felt like anything but a place to sleep. That's all." Margaret's throat tightened. "Jonas." "Yeah. I'm glad Mrs. Henderson lied about the daughter." His eyebrows rose. "Why?" "Because if there'd been a child, I would have focused on her instead of getting to know you. This way we have to figure out how to be partners before we can be anything else." She set the book down carefully. "I think that's better." Jonas studied her for a long moment. Then slowly, he smiled, the first real smile she'd seen from him, and it transformed his entire face. "You're full of surprises, Margaret Blackwood." "So, are you Jonas Blackwood?" On the 6th morning, Margaret woke to find Jonas already gone. A note on the table said he'd ridden out early to check the high pastures and would return by evening. The list of chores was longer than usual. She worked through the morning animals, fed, water hauled, garden tended. By noon, she'd finished everything on the list and decided to tackle the root cellar. Jonas had mentioned it needed organizing, and she wanted to surprise him. The cellar was dark and cool, dug into the hillside behind the cabin. Margaret lit a lantern and descended the earthen steps, already mentally cataloging the preserved foods and winter supplies. That's when she found the dress. It was tucked in the back corner, wrapped in oilcloth, and hidden behind crates of potatoes. Margaret almost missed it, would have missed it if her lantern hadn't caught the edge of blue fabric peeking out. She unwrapped it slowly, carefully. The dress was beautiful. Sky blue calico, with tiny white flowers, made for a woman of average height and generous figure. The stitching was expert, the fabric expensive. Not the kind of dress a rough rancher would buy for himself. Margaret's hands trembled as she examined it. The waist had been let out recently. She could see the newer thread. And there on the hem, a small stain that looked like blood. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Jonas said he'd never had a wife, never had a daughter. So who did this dress belong to? Margaret rewrapped it with shaking hands and returned it to its hiding place. Then she climbed back out of the cellar into the afternoon sunlight, her mind racing. Maybe it had belonged to the woman Jonas saved in Montana, the one whose attacker he'd killed. Maybe he'd kept it as a reminder. Maybe there was a perfectly innocent explanation. Or maybe Jonas Blackwood was a liar, and she'd just married a man whose secrets were buried in the root cellar along with his winter potatoes. Margaret stood in the yard, torn between fear and rationality. Should she confront him? Wait to see if he mentioned it. Pack her bag and run. No, running was impossible. She had no horse, no money, and 3 hours of mountain trail between her and town. And even if she made it to town, where would she go? Back to New York, where nothing had changed, except she'd now be a divorced woman with even fewer prospects. She was trapped here, bound to Jonas by law and circumstance, with a blue calico dress haunting her thoughts. When Jonas returned at dusk, Margaret had dinner ready and her face carefully composed. She watched him wash up at the pump, watched him check the animals, watched him move through his evening routine with his usual efficiency. "Productive day?" he asked over dinner. "Very. Finished your list and organized the root cellar?" Something flickered in Jonas's eyes, too quick to identify. "The cellar? Yes. You mentioned it needed doing." Margaret kept her voice light. "Everything's sorted now. Easier to find things." Jonas chewed slowly, his expression unreadable. "Find anything interesting?" Margaret's heart stuttered. "Just potatoes and preserves." "Why did you lose something?" For a long moment Jonas didn't answer. He just looked at her with those cold eyes, and Margaret wondered if she'd made a terrible mistake by lying. Then he smiled, but it wasn't the warm smile from before. This one was tight controlled. "No, nothing lost." He stood collecting their plates. "I'll clean up tonight. You should rest." Margaret climbed into bed while Jonas worked at the wash basin, her mind churning. She pretended to sleep, but through her lashes she watched him bank the fire and spread his bedroll. Just before he lay down, Jonas paused. He looked toward the door, then toward the bed where Margaret lay, then down at his own hands. Massive hands that could snap a man's neck or mend a torn shirt with equal skill. "Good night, Margaret," he said softly to the darkness. She didn't answer. Couldn't answer because her throat had closed with fear and confusion, and something else she couldn't name. Outside, the wind picked up, howling through the pines like a warning, or maybe like a woman screaming. Margaret pulled the blanket up to her chin and stared at the ceiling, listening to Jonas breathe, listening to the wind, listening to her own heartbeat thunder in her ears. She'd wanted the truth. She'd demanded it. Now she was terrified of what the truth might be. And there were still 4 more parts of this story left to survive. Margaret didn't sleep that night. Every creak of the cabin made her flinch. Every shift of Jonas's breathing made her wonder if he was awake too, watching her in the darkness. The blue dress haunted her thoughts, that blood stain on the hem. The careful alterations, the way Jonas's face had changed when she mentioned the root cellar. By the time gray light seeped through the windows, she'd made a decision. She would work. She would watch. She would learn everything she could about Jonas Blackwood before deciding whether to be afraid. Jonas rose as usual, moving through his morning routine without speaking. Margaret dressed behind the blanket with shaking hands and emerged to find him already stoking the fire. "Coffee," he said, not looking at her. They prepared the morning meal in heavy silence. Margaret's mind raced with questions she didn't dare ask. Finally, as they sat down to eat, Jonas spoke. "You're afraid of me now." It wasn't a question. Margaret's hand froze halfway to her mouth. "I can see it." Jonas continued, his voice flat. "The way you watch me. The way you're sitting closer to the door than usual. You found something in the cellar, and now you think I'm a monster." Margaret set down her fork carefully. "I found a dress." "I know. You knew I'd find it eventually." "Yes." Jonas met her eyes finally. "I should have told you about it before now, should have explained. But He looked away. "I didn't know how. So explain now." Jonas pushed his plate away, his jaw working. When he spoke, his voice was rough with something that might have been grief. "Her name was Sarah. She was a homesteader's wife, farm about 20 miles from where I lived in Montana. Her husband was a drunk mean as a snake when he had liquor in him. Beat her regular. Everyone knew it, but nobody did anything because that was considered a man's right with his own wife." His hands clenched on the table. "I met her in town one day. She was buying supplies, had bruises on her arms she tried to hide. I didn't know her, but I could see the fear in her eyes. Recognized it from my own mother." Margaret's throat tightened, but she said nothing. "I started checking on her," Jonas continued. "Just riding by occasionally, making sure she was alive. Her husband didn't like it, told me to mind my own business. I should have listened." He stood abruptly, moved to the window. "One night I heard screaming. Rode over and found him beating her with a strap. She was on the ground bleeding, begging him to stop. And he wouldn't stop. He just kept hitting her." "So you killed him?" "No." Jonas turned to face her. "I pulled him off her. Knocked him down. Told him if he ever touched her again I'd come back and finish it. Then I helped Sarah inside, made sure she was all right." His voice dropped. "The dress was torn, ripped almost to pieces. I couldn't leave her like that, so I rode into town and bought her a new one. That blue calico. Had Mrs. Henderson help me pick it out." Margaret waited, sensing there was more. "Sarah thanked me," Jonas said quietly. "Told me I'd saved her life. I left feeling like maybe I'd done something good for once." He rubbed his face with both hands. 2 days later, her husband came after me. Drunk, armed, swearing he'd kill me for shaming him in front of his wife. He fired first, missed. I didn't miss. The silence stretched between them, heavy as stone. "The law cleared you," Margaret said finally. "The law cleared me. But Sarah?" Jonas's voice cracked slightly. "She came to the trial. Testified for me. Told everyone what her husband had done, how he'd beaten her, how I'd saved her. It destroyed her reputation. Good women don't speak publicly about their husband's violence. After the trial, her husband's family made sure everyone knew she was the reason their son was dead. They made her life hell." "What happened to her?" "She left Montana. Had family back east somewhere. Before she went, she brought me the dress, said she couldn't keep it, that it reminded her of too much blood and shame." Jonas's shoulders sagged. "I should have thrown it away. Should have burned it. But I couldn't. It was the only proof I had that I'd done something right, even though it all went wrong anyway." Margaret stood slowly crossed to where Jonas stood by the window. Up close, she could see the lines of pain etched in his face, the weight of guilt he carried. "That's why you came here," she said softly. "Not just because his family wanted revenge, because you couldn't stand what your help had cost her. I ruined her life trying to save it." Jonas's voice was barely audible. "And then I was stupid enough to think I deserved another chance at having someone in mine. That's why I sent for a wife, because loneliness was eating me alive, and I thought maybe if I could build something good here, it would make up for what I destroyed in Montana." Margaret's hand moved of its own accord, reaching up to touch Jonas's arm. He flinched, but didn't pull away. "You didn't destroy anything," she said. "Her husband did. His family did. You tried to help, and sometimes helping has consequences that aren't fair or right, but that doesn't make the helping wrong." Jonas looked down at her, and she saw raw vulnerability in his eyes, the kind that made her understand why he hid on this mountain, why he couldn't bear the company of people who might judge him. "You're not afraid anymore," he said. "No, now I understand." Margaret squeezed his arm gently, then let go. "But Jonas, no more secrets. If we're building a life together, I need to know all of it, the good and the bad and the complicated." "There isn't much good." "Then tell me the bad and the complicated, and we'll make good together." Something shifted in Jonas's expression, not quite hope, but close. He nodded slowly. "All right, no more secrets." He took a breath. "But that means you tell me your truths too. Fair's fair." Margaret's stomach dropped. "What do you want to know? Why you really left New York? And don't tell me it was just poverty and no prospects, plenty of poor girls stay where they are. What were you running from?" Margaret moved back to the table, sat down heavily. Her own secrets felt small compared to Jonas's, but they were hers, and shame made them hard to speak. "There was a man," she said finally. "Mr. Grayson. He owned the factory where my oldest sister worked. Rich, married, respected." Her hands clenched in her lap. "He noticed me one day when I came to walk my sister home. Started talking to me, being kind. I was flattered I was 17 and stupid, and nobody had ever paid me that kind of attention before." Jonas sat down across from her, waiting. "He said he could help my family, get my sister better work, maybe find positions for my other sisters too. All I had to do was—" Margaret's voice hardened. "Be nice to him. Meet him sometimes. Let him take care of me." "Did you—" "No. I told him to go to hell." Margaret looked up, meeting Jonas's eyes. "But he didn't like being refused. He spread rumors, told people I'd been his mistress, and then tried to blackmail him when he wouldn't leave his wife. Suddenly nobody in our neighborhood would hire me. Men started calling me names on the street. My mother was ashamed. My sisters couldn't find work because we were all tainted by association. That's when you answered my advertisement. That's when I got desperate enough to marry a stranger and move 2,000 miles away." Margaret's laugh was bitter. "So you see, we both came here running from our pasts. Difference is, you were running from something you actually did." Jonas was quiet for a long moment. Then, "This Mr. Grayson, did he ever touch you?" "He tried once. I broke his nose with my elbow." A grim smile crossed Margaret's face. "That's really what made him vicious. I'd damaged his pride along with his face." "Good," Jonas said simply. "If we ever go back to New York, point him out to me. I'll finish what you started." The casual violence in his voice should have frightened Margaret. Instead, she felt something warm unfurl in her chest, the knowledge that Jonas would defend her, that his capacity for violence could be wielded on her behalf. "We're a fine pair," she said softly. "Both running, both damaged, both trying to build something from broken pieces." "Maybe that's why this can work," Jonas said. "We both know what it's like to fail. Makes us less likely to take success for granted." Margaret smiled, really smiled for the first time since finding the dress. "So, no more secrets." "No more secrets." Jonas stood, held out his hand. "Partners." Margaret took his hand, felt the calluses and strength and warmth of it. "Partners." They shook on it, and something settled between them, not love, not yet, but the foundation it might grow from. Trust. Honesty. Mutual understanding born from shared damage. "Now," Jonas said, releasing her hand. "We have a ranch to run and winter coming. Feel sorry for ourselves later." Margaret laughed, despite everything. "You're romantic as a fence post, you know that." Never claimed otherwise. But his eyes held warmth now, and when he smiled, Margaret felt her heart skip slightly. Maybe this strange marriage could work after all. They fell into their routine, but something had shifted. Jonas spoke more freely now, sharing stories of his childhood and his years in Montana. Margaret reciprocated, telling him about her sisters and her mother, about the streets of New York, and the dreams she'd abandoned. They worked side by side with new ease, and in the evenings, Margaret read while Jonas listened, their comfortable silence filled with possibility. 3 days after their conversation, Margaret woke to find the first snow falling just a dusting, but Jonas took it seriously. "Winter comes fast here," he said over breakfast. "We need to finish preparations. Today we're riding to the high pasture to bring the cattle down." "I don't know how to ride." "You'll learn. Can't live on a ranch without riding." Jonas finished his coffee. "Get dressed warm. We'll be gone most of the day." An hour later, Margaret stood in the barn facing a massive chestnut gelding named Buck. The horse's back was level with her chest, and the stirrups dangled impossibly high. "He's too big," she said. "He's the gentlest horse I have," Jonas replied. "Come on, I'll help you up." Getting into the saddle was an undignified scramble that left Margaret perched precariously atop a living mountain. Buck shifted his weight, and she grabbed the saddle horn with both hands. "Relax," Jonas said, mounting his own horse with casual grace. "He can feel your fear. Just sit deep and follow his movement." Easy for him to say. Jonas looked like he'd been born on horseback, his massive frame somehow perfectly proportioned to the big black stallion he rode. Margaret felt like a child playing dress-up. They set out slowly, Jonas leading the way up a narrow trail that climbed steadily into the high country. Margaret clung to the saddle and tried not to look down at the steep drops beside the trail. Buck plodded along reliably, seeming to know that his rider was incompetent and adjusting his gait accordingly. "Doing good," Jonas called back. "Just keep breathing." "Easy for you to say. You're not about to die." "Nobody's dying. Buck's carried greenhorns before. He knows his job." By the time they reached the high pasture, Margaret's legs ached and her hands were cramped from gripping too hard. But she'd stayed in the saddle and pride flickered in her chest at that small victory. The cattle were scattered across a broad meadow grazing peacefully. Jonas surveyed them with a practiced eye. "We'll work them slow," he said. "I'll ride around and start them moving toward the trail. You stay behind them, not too close, just close enough to keep them from turning back. When they commit to the trail, we follow them down. Understand?" Margaret nodded, though she understood maybe half of what he'd said. Jonas circled the herd with easy confidence, and slowly the cattle began moving toward the trail opening. Margaret followed as instructed, trying to copy Jonas's calm authority. Buck seemed to know what to do better than she did, moving where he needed to without much guidance. Everything was going smoothly, until a young calf broke away from the group, panicked by something Margaret couldn't see. It bolted toward the trees, and its mother bellowed and charged after it. "Go!" Jonas shouted. "Turn them back!" Margaret kicked Buck harder than she intended, and the gelding leaped forward. She grabbed the saddle horn as Buck surged after the cow and calf, moving faster than Margaret had thought possible. They cut across the meadow at a gallop, and Margaret's heart lodged in her throat as the ground blurred beneath them. Buck somehow got ahead of the cow, turning her back toward the herd. The calf followed its mother, and just like that, the crisis was over. Buck slowed to a walk, and Margaret realized she was shaking. Jonas rode up beside her, grinning. "That was good work. I didn't do anything. Buck did it all. You didn't fall off, didn't panic, didn't interfere. That's doing something." Jonas's grin widened. "You're a natural." Warmth spread through Margaret despite her trembling legs. Liar. Truth. Now let's get these cattle down before the weather turns. The trip down took hours. The cattle moved slowly, occasionally trying to break away, and Margaret learned to anticipate their movements and position Buck to block them. By the time they reached the lower pastures near the ranch, she was exhausted but exhilarated. "That wasn't so bad," she said as they unsaddled the horses. Jonas laughed a real laugh, deep and genuine. "Wait until tomorrow when you can't walk. You'll hate me." He was right. The next morning, Margaret's legs screamed with every movement, and muscles she didn't know existed announced their protest. She hobbled to the barn like an old woman, and Jonas pretended not to notice. But that evening, as they sat by the fire, Jonas said quietly, "You did well yesterday. Better than well. You've got courage, Margaret." Or stupidity. Still not sure which. Courage and stupidity look the same sometimes. Difference is whether you survive. Jonas looked at her seriously. "You're going to survive here. I'm sure of it now." Margaret met his eyes, saw genuine respect there, and felt something shift again in her chest. She'd come here expecting duty and hardship. She hadn't expected partnership. Hadn't expected someone who saw her strength instead of her weakness. "Jonas," she said softly, "thank you." "For what?" "For giving me a chance to be more than I was." Jonas's expression softened. "Same to you, Margaret Blackwood. Same to you." The days grew shorter and colder. Snow fell more frequently, dusting the peaks and lingering in the shadows. Jonas worked with increased urgency, preparing the ranch for winter's assault. Margaret worked beside him, learning to split wood, preserve meat, store root vegetables in ways that would keep them from freezing. One afternoon, while Jonas was out checking fence lines, Margaret decided to tackle a project she'd been contemplating. The cabin was functional, but joyless. No curtains, no decoration, nothing to make it feel like a home. She dug through her carpet bag and found the one luxury she'd brought from New York, a piece of fine linen she'd embroidered with flowers during the long winter nights before leaving. It wasn't much, but she could make it into a curtain for the window, give the cabin some softness, some beauty. She was measuring the fabric when Jonas returned, stamping snow from his boots. "What's that?" he asked. "I thought I'd make a curtain, make the place less stark." Margaret felt suddenly foolish. "If that's all right." Jonas crossed to where she stood, looking at the delicate embroidery. His expression was unreadable. "You made this?" he asked. "Back in New York. It was going to be a tablecloth, but a curtain makes more sense here." Jonas touched the fabric gently, his rough fingers careful on the fine work. "It's beautiful. Too beautiful for this rough place." "This rough place is my home now," Margaret said firmly. "It deserves something beautiful." Jonas looked at her for a long moment. Then, without warning, he pulled her into a hug, quick and awkward, but genuine. Margaret stiffened in surprise, then relaxed into it. He smelled of pine and horse and wood smoke, and his massive frame somehow made her feel safe instead of threatened. He released her just as quickly, looking embarrassed. "Sorry, thank you. For staying, for trying, for making this place feel less lonely." Margaret's eyes stung with unexpected tears. "You're welcome." They hung the curtain together, Jonas holding it high while Margaret tacked it in place. When they finished, the cabin looked transformed, not elegant, but homey, lived in, cared for. That night, as Margaret read by firelight, she glanced up to find Jonas watching her with an expression she couldn't quite name. When their eyes met, he didn't look away. "Margaret," he said quietly, "I want you to know something. This marriage, it was supposed to be practical, convenient, a solution to loneliness and necessity. But you've become more than that. More than I expected or deserved." Margaret's heart hammered. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that if you want to keep sleeping in that bed alone, I'll respect that. But if you ever decide you want a real marriage, not just a partnership, but something deeper, I'd be honored." He looked down at his hands. "No pressure, no expectation, just letting you know where I stand." Margaret set down the book, her hands trembling. She thought about the past weeks, the shared work, the growing trust, the moments of unexpected warmth. She thought about Jonas's honesty, his patience, his surprising gentleness beneath the rough exterior. She thought about the fact that somewhere along the way, she'd stopped being afraid and started hoping. "I need time," she said softly. "Not because I don't. Not because you haven't. I just need to be sure. To know that when I say yes, it's because I want to, not because I'm obligated or grateful or scared of being alone." Jonas nodded relief, and something like respect crossing his face. "Take all the time you need. I'm not going anywhere." "Neither am I." They smiled at each other, and the air between them felt charged with possibility. Margaret picked up the book again, but the words blurred on the page. She was too aware of Jonas across the room, too aware of her own heartbeat, too aware that something was building between them, something that might become love, if they were careful enough to let it grow. 2 weeks later, a massive storm rolled in from the north. Jonas spent the day securing everything that could blow away, bringing extra hay into the barn, checking and double-checking their preparations. "This one's going to be bad," he said at dinner. "Could last 3 days or more. We'll need to stay inside except for essential chores." He was right. The storm hit that night with furious intensity, wind howling like demons, and snow falling so thick that Margaret couldn't see the barn from the cabin window. The temperature plummeted, and even with the fire roaring cold, seeped through every crack. Morning came gray and brutal. Jonas bundled up in every layer he owned and forced his way to the barn to feed the animals. Margaret watched anxiously from the window until he emerged snow-covered and half-frozen. "All secure," he said, stripping off his outer layers. His lips were blue, his hands shaking. "But it's getting worse. I'll need to check them again tonight." Margaret heated water and made him drink hot coffee laced with honey. They huddled near the fire, listening to the storm rage outside. By afternoon, the temperature inside the cabin had dropped, despite their best efforts. Jonas added more wood to the fire, but they were burning through their supply faster than he liked. "We need to conserve," he said. "Can't burn everything in the first day." That night they both felt the cold settling deep into their bones. Margaret lay in bed fully clothed, wrapped in every blanket she had, and still she shivered. Across the room, she could hear Jonas's teeth chattering as he tried to sleep on the floor near the dying fire. This was stupid. They were both freezing to death out of propriety and fear. "Jonas?" she called softly. "Yeah, come here. We'll freeze if we stay separate." Silence. Then, "You sure?" "I'm sure I don't want to die of cold on principle. Come on." Jonas gathered his bedroll and crossed to the bed. He lay down on top of the blankets, still fully clothed, maintaining careful distance. But his body heat was immediate and blessed, and Margaret felt herself stop shivering for the first time in hours. "Better?" he asked. "Much better. You—" "Yeah." He shifted slightly, trying to get comfortable without touching her. "Margaret." Thank you for trusting me." Margaret turned to face him in the darkness. She could just make out his profile, the strong line of his jaw, the way his eyes reflected what little light came from the fire's embers. "I do trust you," she said softly. "More than I thought I could trust anyone." Jonas turned his head to look at her, and suddenly his face was very close. Margaret's breath caught. Neither of them moved, but the air between them felt electric, charged with possibility. "I want to kiss you," Jonas whispered, "but I won't, unless you want it too." Margaret's heart thundered. Outside the storm raged. Inside heat built between them that had nothing to do with the fire. "I want it too," she breathed. Jonas closed the distance slowly, giving her every chance to change her mind. When his lips finally met hers, the kiss was gentle, tentative. Nothing like Margaret had expected from such a massive, rough man. His hand came up to cup her face, careful, as if she were made of glass. Margaret pressed closer, her hands finding his chest, feeling his heart hammering as fast as her own. The kiss deepened, and suddenly all the weeks of tension and careful distance burned away in mutual need. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Jonas rested his forehead against hers. "Been wanting to do that for weeks," he admitted. "Me too," Margaret confessed. "I just wasn't ready to admit it." They lay facing each other, hands intertwined, and talked through the night. About their fears and hopes, about the future they might build together, about the strange and unexpected path that had brought them to this moment. Somewhere in those dark hours, with the storm raging outside and warmth building between them, Margaret Blackwood fell in love with her husband. And judging by the way Jonas held her gentle and fierce and infinitely careful, he'd fallen too. When morning came, they emerged from the bed as something more than partners, more than friends. The storm had trapped them together and somehow set them free. The storm lasted 4 days, and by the time it finally broke, Margaret and Jonas had crossed a threshold neither could uncross. They woke tangled together on the 4th morning, the silence outside almost shocking after days of howling wind. Jonas stirred first, his arm tightening around Margaret's waist before he seemed to fully wake and remember where he was. "Morning," he murmured against her hair. "Morning." Margaret didn't move, savoring the warmth and closeness. "Storm's over." "Yeah." Jonas's chest rose and fell beneath her cheek. "Means we need to dig out. Check for damage. See if any animals are in trouble." "I know." But neither of them moved yet. The real world could wait 5 more minutes. When they finally rose and dressed, Margaret felt the weight of what had changed between them. They'd spent 4 days and nights in the same bed, sharing warmth and whispered conversations and careful touches that promised more. They hadn't consummated the marriage Jonas had been adamant about, that saying he wanted her sure and willing in full daylight, not just desperate for warmth in a storm. But they'd crossed every other line, learning each other's bodies and hearts in the enforced intimacy of survival. Now facing each other across the cabin in morning light, Margaret felt suddenly shy. Jonas seemed to feel it too, his movements careful as he stoked the fire and put coffee on to boil. "Margaret," he said finally, not looking at her. "Last night, all these nights, I don't want you to think I took advantage. The storm, the cold, the situation." "Stop." Margaret crossed to him, placed her hand on his arm. "I knew what I was doing, what we were doing. I wanted it, Jonas, all of it." He turned to face her, searching her eyes. "You sure? Because once we step through that door and go back to normal life, I need to know this was real, that you weren't just scared or cold or—" Margaret stood on her toes and kissed him, cutting off his words. When she pulled back, she said firmly, "It was real, is real. I love you, you stubborn man." Jonas's eyes widened. "You, love you, yes." Margaret's heart hammered, but she held his gaze. "I didn't plan to, didn't expect to. But somewhere between hauling water and learning to ride and watching you mend a broken fence in freezing rain because the cattle needed it done, I fell in love with you. So if you're about to tell me you don't feel the same, do it quick so I can die of embarrassment and get it over with." Jonas laughed, a sound of pure joy that transformed his entire face. He swept Margaret up in his arms, lifting her off her feet as easily as if she weighed nothing. "I love you too," he said, spinning her once before setting her down. "God, Margaret, I've been half in love with you since you told me my ranch could kill us both, and then asked when we could start working. You're the bravest, stubbornest, most surprising woman I've ever met, and I don't deserve you, but I'm selfish enough to keep you anyway." Margaret buried her face in his chest, laughing and crying at the same time. "We're both selfish then, because I'm not going anywhere." They held each other while the coffee boiled over, unnoticed steam hissing against the hot stove. When they finally pulled apart, both grinning like fools, Jonas said, "We should probably save that coffee before it all burns away." Probably. But Margaret didn't move, too caught up in the wonder of this moment, standing in a rough cabin on a Colorado mountain in the arms of a man she'd married as a stranger and learned to love as a partner. The work waiting outside finally forced them apart. Jonas bundled up and went to check the animals, while Margaret salvaged what she could of the coffee and started breakfast. When Jonas returned, snow-covered and breathing hard, his expression was grim. "Lost part of the barn roof. Snow weight was too much. Horses are fine, but we'll need to repair it before the next storm." He stamped snow from his boots. "And the trail to town is going to be impassable for at least a week, maybe more. We're completely cut off." Margaret absorbed this. "Do we have enough supplies?" "If we're careful, but it means no trading, no outside help if something goes wrong, no doctor if one of us gets hurt." Jonas met her eyes. You signed up for a hard life, but this is when it gets real. Being trapped up here with winter settling in, it tests everything." "Then we'll pass the test," Margaret said simply. "Together." Jonas's expression softened. "Together," he agreed. They spent the day digging out clearing paths to the barn and woodshed, checking fences buried under snowdrifts, taking inventory of their supplies. The work was brutally hard, and by evening, Margaret's muscles screamed. But there was something satisfying about it too, about working beside Jonas to secure their small kingdom against winter's siege. That night, after a simple dinner, Jonas pulled out a piece of paper and a pencil stub. "We should make a plan," he said. "List out what we have, what we'll need, how long we can last if we're snowed in all winter." They worked through the calculations together. 50 pounds of flour, 30 of cornmeal, dried beans and salted meat and preserved vegetables. Hay for the animals, wood for heat and cooking. It was tight, but they'd make it if they were careful, and nothing went catastrophically wrong. "What about Christmas?" Margaret asked suddenly. Jonas looked up in surprise. "What about it? It's 3 weeks away. Do you celebrate it?" Jonas shrugged. "Never had much reason to. Usually just another day of work." Margaret felt a pang of sadness. "We should do something. Mark it somehow. Even if it's small." "Like what?" "I don't know yet. Let me think about it." An idea was forming in her mind, but she wanted to work out the details before sharing it. Over the next 2 weeks, while Jonas worked on repairing the barn roof and maintaining their defenses against the cold, Margaret secretly worked on Christmas preparations. She used precious flour to practice making a special bread. She dug out the blue calico dress from the root cellar and carefully cut it into pieces, fashioning a new shirt for Jonas. Something finer than the rough work shirts he usually wore. And she used scraps from her own dresses to make something she'd seen in a shop window once, but never owned a quilted coverlet for their bed. Because it was their bed now. After that first kiss during the storm, they'd stopped pretending otherwise. Jonas had moved his things to the bedroom, and they shared the bed each night, though Jonas was still maddeningly patient about waiting for Margaret to say she was ready for more. 3 days before Christmas, Jonas came in from morning chores with an odd expression. "What's wrong?" Margaret asked. "Nothing's wrong. Just come outside for a minute." Puzzled, Margaret followed him out into the bitter cold. Jonas led her around to the side of the cabin where he'd clearly been working on something. There, leaning against the wall, was a small pine tree, freshly cut branches still green and fragrant. "I thought," Jonas said, suddenly shy, "if we're marking Christmas, we should do it proper. My mother used to bring a tree inside when I was small, before things got bad. I remember the smell of it, how it made the whole house feel different." Margaret's throat tightened. "Jonas, it's perfect." They brought the tree inside and set it up in the corner. Margaret fashioned decorations from what they had: strings of dried berries, paper stars, cut from the margins of Jonas's old newspapers, strips of cloth tied into bows. It wasn't much, but it transformed the cabin, made it feel festive and special. On Christmas Eve, Margaret surprised Jonas with the shirt she'd made. His hands trembled as he held it up, examining the careful stitching. "You made this from Sarah's dress," he said quietly. "I hope that's all right. It seemed wrong to let such beautiful fabric just sit in the dark. And this way, something good came from something painful." Margaret watched his face anxiously. "If you don't want it, I understand." Jonas pulled the shirt on over his work shirt, and despite the rough alterations Margaret had made to fit his massive frame, it looked right on him. He touched the fabric wonderingly. "It's the finest thing I've ever owned," he said. "Thank you. There's more." Margaret pulled out the quilted coverlet, unfolding it to show the pattern she'd pieced together from scraps, blues and browns and creams that somehow came together into something beautiful. "For our bed, so we're warmer on the cold nights." Jonas ran his hand over the quilt, and Margaret saw his eyes grow bright with unshed tears. You did all this while I was working. Made these things for me. For us, Margaret corrected gently. This is our home now, our life. I wanted to mark that somehow. Jonas pulled her close, and Margaret felt him trembling slightly. When he spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. I have something for you too. It's not much, but... He released her and crossed to the chest where he kept his few possessions. From the very bottom, he pulled out a small wooden box. Inside was a ring, simple silver set with a small blue stone that caught the firelight. It was my mother's, Jonas said quietly. The only thing of hers I kept. I thought, if you wanted, it could be yours now. A proper wedding ring, not just a paper marriage. Margaret's hands shook as she took the box. The ring was beautiful in its simplicity, worn smooth by years of wear. She could imagine Jonas's mother wearing it, could imagine the love and pain and survival it had witnessed. Tell me about her, Margaret said softly. Jonas sat down heavily, the wooden box still open in Margaret's hands. She was small like you. Tough, though, had to be married to my father. She used to sing while she worked, even on the hardest days. Said singing made the work go faster. He smiled sadly. She tried to protect me from him when I was small. Took beatings meant for me until I got big enough that he started coming after me instead. How did she die? Fever. I was 15. By then I was bigger than my father, and he'd stopped hitting either of us because he knew I'd hit back. But the years of abuse had worn her down, made her weak. When the fever came, she just didn't have the strength to fight it. Jonas's hands clenched. 3 months after she died, I killed my father. Didn't mean to. He came at me drunk. I defended myself and he fell wrong. Cracked his skull. The law said it was self-defense, but I knew the truth. Part of me wanted him dead. Margaret set down the box and took Jonas's hands in hers. You were a child protecting yourself from a monster. That's not murder, Jonas. That's survival. Tell that to the part of me that still sees his face sometimes at night. Jonas looked at their joined hands. I wanted you to know the whole truth before you put on that ring. Wanted you to understand exactly what kind of man you're binding yourself to. I see a man who survived hell and still has enough heart left to be gentle, Margaret said firmly. I see a man who protects those who need protecting, even when it costs him everything. I see a man I'm proud to call my husband. She picked up the ring, slid it onto her finger. It fit perfectly, as if it had been made for her. And I see a man I choose freely and completely to build a life with. Jonas pulled her into his arms, and they held each other in front of the Christmas tree, while the fire crackled and snow fell softly outside. When Jonas finally pulled back, there were tears on his cheeks. I don't know what I did to deserve you, he whispered. You opened your door to a desperate woman and gave her a chance to become something more, Margaret replied. You taught me to be strong. You showed me what partnership looks like. You loved me even when I was still learning to love myself. They kissed, then deep and passionate and full of promise. When they broke apart, both breathing hard, Jonas said roughly, Margaret, I want, if you're ready. I'm ready, Margaret said. I've been ready. I was just waiting for you to stop being so damn noble about it. Jonas laughed, the sound surprised out of him. Then he swept her up in his arms and carried her to their bed, and they consummated their marriage by firelight on Christmas Eve, while snow blanketed the world outside in silence. Afterward, lying tangled together under the new quilt, Margaret felt more complete than she'd ever felt in her life. Jonas traced lazy patterns on her shoulder, his touch reverent. I love you, he said softly. Never thought I'd say those words to anyone and mean them. But God. Margaret, I love you. I love you too. Margaret pressed a kiss to his chest over his heart. Merry Christmas, Jonas Blackwood. Merry Christmas, Mrs. Blackwood. They dozed together warm and safe in their small cabin while winter raged outside. When Margaret woke hours later, she found Jonas watching her with such tenderness that her breath caught. "What?" she asked, smiling. "Just thinking about how different this Christmas is from last year. Last year, I was alone, half frozen, wondering if I'd make it through winter. Now I have you." He tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. "You saved my life, Margaret. Not just from loneliness, from disappearing entirely. You made me human again." "You saved mine too," Margaret said. "From a life of shame and poverty and slow death in a New York tenement. You gave me purpose and partnership and love. We saved each other." They made love again as dawn broke, slower and sweeter this time, learning each other's rhythms and preferences. By the time they finally rose and dressed, the day was half gone, but neither regretted the lost time. Some things were more important than work. Christmas Day was simple, but perfect. Margaret made the special bread she'd been practicing, and it turned out beautifully golden and fragrant, better than anything Jonas had tasted. They ate it with preserves and fresh butter from their cow, and Jonas declared it the finest Christmas feast he'd ever had. "Even better than when your mother was alive?" Margaret asked. Jonas considered this seriously. "Different. She made amazing things with almost nothing, could stretch a single chicken into meals for a week. But this is the first Christmas I've had where I felt safe, where I wasn't waiting for violence or judgment or something to go wrong. That makes it better, yeah." In the afternoon, they played cards, a battered deck Jonas had bought years ago but rarely used. Margaret taught him games she'd learned in New York, and he taught her a gambling game that had gotten him thrown out of a saloon once. They laughed and teased each other, and the cabin rang with joy in a way it never had before. As evening fell and they settled by the fire, Jonas said thoughtfully, "Next year will be different." "How so?" "Next year we'll have more. We can trade in town, get proper supplies for a real feast, maybe even invite Mrs. Henderson up. She's been kind to us, deserves to see what came of her matchmaking." He pulled Margaret closer. "And maybe by next Christmas, there'll be 3 of us." Margaret's heart skipped. They'd talked around the subject of children, but Jonas had never mentioned it directly. "You want children?" "With you, yes." Jonas's hand moved to her stomach, resting there gently. "Want to fill this cabin with noise and laughter and chaos. Want to give our kids the childhood we didn't have, one where they're safe and loved and never have to be afraid." He looked at her seriously. "But only if you want that too. I know pregnancy and childbirth are dangerous, especially up here with no doctor. I won't pressure you." Margaret covered his hand with hers. "I want it. Want to build a family with you. Want our children to know that love is possible, even after pain." She smiled. "Though maybe we should get through this winter first before we start planning dynasties." Jonas laughed. "Fair point. One season at a time." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the fire burn down. Margaret thought about the journey that had brought her here. The desperation that drove her from New York, the fear of that first meeting, the slow building of trust and partnership, and finally, love. If someone had told her 6 months ago that she'd be sitting in a Colorado cabin on Christmas night, happily married to a giant of a man and planning a future together, she would have laughed at the impossibility of it. But here she was, here they were, 2 broken people who'd somehow managed to heal each other, build something beautiful from painful pasts. "Jonas," Margaret said softly. Thank you for answering that advertisement, for taking a chance on a desperate city girl with no skills and too much pride." Jonas pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "Thank you for being brave enough to come, for staying when you discovered the truth, for loving me despite everything I am and everything I've done." "Not despite," Margaret corrected. "Because of all of it, the good and the bad and the complicated, made you who you are. And who you are is exactly who I need." They stayed up late that night, talking about their plans for the ranch, for their future, for the life they'd build together. When they finally went to bed exhausted and happy, Margaret fell asleep thinking that this had been the best Christmas of her life. She woke 3 hours later to Jonas shaking her shoulder urgently. "Margaret, something's wrong with the cow." She bolted upright, instantly alert. "What kind of wrong?" "She's down and can't get up, breathing hard, distressed." Jonas was already pulling on his boots. "Could be bloat, could be something she ate, could be she's dying. I need to check her, but I wanted you to know where I was going." "I'm coming with you." "No need, you should stay warm." "I'm coming," Margaret said firmly, already dressing. "We're partners, remember? That means the hard parts, too." They bundled up and fought their way through knee-deep snow to the barn. Inside, the milk cow lay on her side, her breathing labored and her eyes wild with pain. The other animals shifted nervously in their stalls, sensing distress. Jonas knelt beside the cow, running his hands over her swollen belly. Bloat. She got into the grain, somehow ate too much, and now gas is building up in her stomach. If we don't relieve the pressure, she'll die. What do we need to do? Hold her head. Keep her calm. This is going to hurt her, and she'll try to fight. Jonas pulled out his knife, and Margaret's stomach dropped. You're going to cut her. Have to. It's the only way to release the gas fast enough. Jonas's face was grim. I've done it before, but it's not pleasant. You sure you want to stay? Margaret positioned herself at the cow's head, gripping her halter firmly. I'm sure. Do it. Jonas worked with swift, sure movements, making a small incision in the cow's side. The smell of released gas was overwhelming, and the cow bellowed in pain, thrashing weakly. Margaret held on, murmuring soothing words, even as her own stomach churned. After what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, the cow's breathing eased. Jonas packed the wound with clean cloth and sat back exhausted. She'll live. Wound should heal clean if we keep it dressed and watch for infection. He looked at Margaret, who was pale but steady. You did good. Most people would have run. Most people didn't promise to handle the hard parts, Margaret replied. She was shaking now, adrenaline wearing off, but she felt proud too. She'd helped. She'd been useful in a crisis. They stayed with the cow until dawn, making sure she was stable. By the time they trudged back to the cabin, both were exhausted and covered in blood and worse. Merry day after Christmas, Jonas said wryly as they stripped off their fouled outer clothes. Margaret laughed despite her exhaustion. Never a dull moment on the Blackwood ranch. They heated water and washed as best they could, then collapsed into bed for a few hours of sleep. When Margaret woke, she found Jonas already up making coffee and looking thoughtful. What's on your mind? She asked. Just thinking about how you didn't hesitate last night. Didn't complain or get sick or fall apart. You just did what needed doing. He handed her a cup of coffee. You've become a real ranch wife, Margaret. Tough as nails and twice as useful. Margaret felt warmth spread through her chest. High praise from Jonas Blackwood. Truth from your husband, he corrected. And truth is, I don't know what I'd do without you anymore. You're not just my wife, you're my partner in every way that matters. The ranch would fail without you. I'd fail without you. Margaret set down her coffee and crossed to him, wrapping her arms around his waist. Good thing you don't have to find out. I'm not going anywhere. Jonas held her close, and they stood together in the morning light. Two people who'd found in each other something neither had been looking for, but both desperately needed. Outside, the world was buried in snow and ice. But inside the cabin, warmth bloomed, built from trust and work and love strong enough to withstand any storm winter could throw at them. They had survived the first test of their marriage. There would be more, many more, as winter tightened its grip and spring seemed impossibly far away. But Margaret wasn't afraid anymore. Whatever came next, they would face it together. And together, they were strong enough for anything. January came with teeth-bared temperatures plunging so low that water froze in the cabin overnight, despite the fire burning constantly. Margaret woke one morning to find ice crystals on the inside of the windows and her breath visible in the air. Jonas was already up feeding the fire with methodical determination. "Coldest night yet," he said without turning around. "Going to be a hard day." He wasn't wrong. The animals needed extra care in weather like this, more feed to keep their body heat up, water that had to be hauled and thawed multiple times, constant checking to ensure no one was succumbing to the cold. Margaret and Jonas worked in shifts, one always staying inside to maintain the fire, while the other ventured out into the brutal wind. By evening, they were both exhausted and half frozen despite their best efforts. Jonas's fingers were white at the tips, and Margaret couldn't stop shivering even after she'd been inside for an hour. "Come here," Jonas said, pulling her close to the fire. He rubbed her hands between his, trying to restore circulation. "You're working too hard. Can't let yourself get this cold." "Says the man whose fingers look like they belong on a corpse," Margaret retorted, but she leaned into his warmth gratefully. "I'm used to it. You're not." Jonas continued massaging her hands, his touch gentle, despite his own discomfort. "Need to be more careful. Frostbite doesn't give second chances." That night, they huddled together under every blanket they owned, their bodies pressed close for warmth. Margaret felt Jonas shivering despite his attempts to hide it, and fear crept into her heart. They'd survived so much already: the initial awkwardness, the growing pains of partnership, even the storm that had brought them together. But winter still had months to run, and their supplies were dwindling faster than Jonas had anticipated. "Jonas," she whispered into the darkness, "what if we don't make it?" His arms tightened around her. "We'll make it." "But what if we don't? What if the cold gets too much, or we run out of food, or—" "Margaret," Jonas's voice was firm, "look at me." She turned in his arms, trying to make out his face in the firelight. "We're going to make it," he said, "because giving up isn't in either of our natures. We've both survived worse than cold and hunger. We'll survive this too." "How can you be so sure?" "Because I have something to live for now. Before you, I was just existing, going through motions, waiting for winter to finally take me. But now—" he cupped her face in his hands. "Now I have a future worth fighting for. A wife I love, plans for children, and a life together. That's worth any amount of suffering." Margaret's throat tightened. "I'm scared, Jonas. I don't want to lose this. Lose you." "You won't. I promise you won't." He kissed her forehead, her cheeks, her lips. "We're stronger together than winter is cruel. Remember that." They made love that night with desperate intensity, reaffirming their connection and their determination to survive. Afterward, wrapped in each other's arms, Margaret felt her fear recede slightly. Jonas was right. They were stronger together. They had to be. The next week brought a brief reprieve, temperatures rising just enough to make the work bearable. Jonas used the opportunity to hunt, bringing down a deer that would replenish their dwindling meat supply. Margaret worked on preserving it, her hands moving with the confidence born of months of practice. She was no longer the frightened city girl who'd arrived in September. She'd become someone capable, someone who could handle butchering and blood and the harsh realities of survival. "You've changed," Jonas observed one evening, watching her work on mending his torn coat. "From the woman who showed up on my doorstep. You're harder now. Stronger." Margaret considered this. "Is that a bad thing?" "No, it's necessary. But I worry sometimes that the softness that made you kind is getting worn away by the harshness of this life." Margaret set down her needle and thread. "The softness is still there. It just has calluses now." She held up her work-roughened hands. "Like these. Still my hands, still capable of gentleness. Just tougher than they used to be." Jonas took her hands in his, kissing the calluses and scars. "I never wanted to make you hard. You didn't make me anything. I chose this. Chose you. Chose to become someone who could survive here." She smiled. "Besides, hard and soft aren't opposites. I can be both strong enough to butcher a deer and still cry at night when I miss my sisters." Tough enough to haul water in freezing weather and still want you to hold me when I'm scared. You're remarkable, Jonas said softly. Do you know that? I'm just doing what needs doing, same as you. No. Jonas shook his head. What you're doing is extraordinary. You came here with nothing, no skills, no experience, no understanding of this life. And you've not just survived, you've thrived. You've made this cabin into a home. You've learned to work a ranch that would break most men. And you've loved me despite every reason not to. His voice grew thick with emotion. That's not just doing what needs doing. That's choosing to be exceptional. Margaret felt tears prick her eyes. Jonas, let me finish. He took her face in his hands. I need you to know that even on the hardest days, even when I'm exhausted and frozen and wondering if we'll make it, I'm grateful. Grateful that you stayed. Grateful that you chose me. Grateful that I get to spend whatever time we have, whether it's 50 more years or 50 more days with you. Don't talk like that, Margaret said, her voice breaking. We're going to have those 50 years. We're going to survive this winter and have children and grow old together. Don't you dare suggest otherwise. Jonas pulled her into his arms. You're right. I'm sorry. Just feeling maudlin tonight. They held each other while the fire crackled and the wind howled outside, two people clinging to hope and each other in equal measure. The next morning brought unexpected drama. Jonas was out checking the fence lines when Margaret heard hoofbeats approaching the cabin, impossible in this weather, unless someone was desperate or foolish. She grabbed Jonas's rifle from beside the door and peered out the window. A man on horseback was struggling up the trail, his horse floundering in the deep snow. Even from a distance, Margaret could see he was in trouble, hunched over in the saddle movements uncoordinated. As he got closer, she realized with a shock that it was Reverend Matthews from town, the elderly minister who'd witnessed their proxy marriage. Margaret threw open the door and ran out into the cold without bothering with a coat. Reverend Matthews, what's happened? The old man nearly fell from his horse and Margaret caught him staggering under his weight. He was burning with fever, his lips cracked and bleeding, his eyes unfocused. Mrs. Blackwood, he mumbled. Didn't know where else to go. Jonas. Margaret screamed, half carrying the Reverend toward the cabin. Jonas, I need help. Jonas appeared from behind the barn, took one look at the situation, and ran. Together they got Reverend Matthews inside and onto the bed. Jonas stripped off the man's wet clothes while Margaret heated water and gathered blankets. What's he doing out here? Jonas demanded. Nobody rides in weather like this unless they're running from something. Or toward something, Margaret said, pressing her hand to the Reverend's forehead. The heat radiating from his skin was terrifying. He's burning up. This isn't just cold, he's seriously ill. Jonas cursed under his breath. Probably pneumonia, maybe worse. And we're days from town with no doctor. Then we'll have to be his doctors. Margaret's voice was steadier than she felt. What do we need? They worked through the night, taking turns sponging the Reverend with cool water to bring down his fever, forcing water and broth between his cracked lips, keeping him warm, but not too warm. The old man drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes lucid enough to speak, sometimes delirious with fever. During one of his lucid moments, he grasped Margaret's hand weakly. Had to warn you, he whispered. Warn us about what? Margaret leaned closer. Men came to town, asking about Jonas Blackwood, said they were family of the man he killed in Montana. The Reverend coughed, a wet, rattling sound that made Margaret's stomach clench. They know he's here. They're coming. Ice that had nothing to do with the weather flooded Margaret's veins. She looked up to find Jonas standing frozen in the doorway, his face drained of color. When? Jonas asked hoarsely. They were waiting for better weather. Said they'd ride up as soon as the trails cleared. Reverend Matthews' eyes closed. I tried to leave sooner, tried to get here before them. But the weather? You nearly killed yourself getting here, Margaret said, squeezing his hand. Thank you. Now rest. We'll figure this out. But as the Reverend slipped back into feverish sleep, Margaret looked at Jonas and saw naked fear in his eyes. Not fear for himself, but fear for what might happen to her if those men came. We need to plan, she said quietly. Jonas shook his head. No. You need to leave. As soon as the weather clears enough for travel, I'm taking you down to town. You can stay with Mrs. Henderson until this is resolved. Absolutely not. Margaret? No. She stood facing him squarely. I'm not leaving you to face this alone. We're partners, remember? That means I stay. These men want to kill me. They might hurt you to get to me. I won't risk that. And I won't abandon my husband when he needs me most. Margaret's voice was steel. We face this together or we don't face it at all. They stared at each other, neither willing to back down. Finally, Jonas's shoulders sagged. If anything happens to you because of me, then we'll deal with it together. But I'm not running, Jonas. I ran from New York and I'm not running anymore. This is my home. You're my husband. I fight for what's mine. Jonas pulled her close, burying his face in her hair. She felt him trembling and held him tighter, trying to give him the strength he'd so often given her. What are we going to do? She whispered. Survive, Jonas said grimly. Same as always. And if they come looking for blood, they'll find I'm not the same man I was in Montana. I have something worth protecting now. That makes me more dangerous than they can imagine. Reverend Matthew's condition worsened over the next 2 days, despite their best efforts. His fever spiked and fell unpredictably. His breathing grew more labored, and he began coughing up blood. Margaret and Jonas took turns sitting with him, trying to keep him comfortable, but they both knew he was dying. On the third night, the Reverend woke clear-eyed for the first time since his arrival. He looked around the cabin, then at Margaret and Jonas sitting beside the bed. I'm not going to make it, he said calmly. Don't talk like that, Margaret protested, but the Reverend held up a weak hand. I'm old, and I'm tired, and this mountain is claiming me. That's all right. I've made my peace with God. He looked at Jonas. But before I go, I need to tell you something. Jonas leaned forward. What is it? Those men who are coming, they're not just after revenge. They've been hired. The Reverend coughed wetly. The dead man's father put a bounty on you. $500 to whoever brings proof of your death. That's why they're coming now in winter, because the money's good enough to risk the weather. Margaret felt sick. Hired killers. Bounty hunters. 3 of them, according to the talk in town. Hard men who've done this kind of work before. The Reverend's eyes closed briefly, then opened again. You need to be ready. They won't stop until they get what they came for, or until you stop them permanently. I won't kill unless I have to, Jonas said. Then be prepared to have to. The Reverend reached out, grasping Jonas's wrist with surprising strength. I know your heart, Jonas Blackwood. I've seen how you've built this life, how you've loved this woman, how you've tried to be better than your past. But sometimes the past doesn't let go easily. Sometimes you have to fight for your future with everything you have. Jonas nodded slowly, his jaw tight. The Reverend turned to Margaret. And you, Mrs. Blackwood, you're stronger than you look. I've known that since the day you stood in my church and married this man without ever laying eyes on him. That took courage. Now you'll need to find even more courage. Can you do that? Yes, Margaret said without hesitation. For Jonas, for our life together, yes. Good. The Reverend relaxed back against the pillows. Then I can die knowing I did what I came to do. I warned you. The rest is in God's hands. Don't talk about dying, Margaret said, but her voice lacked conviction. She could see death hovering over the old man like a shadow. Reverend Matthews smiled peacefully. Child, I've been a minister for 40 years. I've sat with the dying countless times. I know the signs, and I'm ready." He closed his eyes. "Just promise me you'll bury me proper when the ground thaws, and that you'll name your first child Matthew if it's a boy or Grace if it's a girl. I'd like to think some part of me will live on here." "We promise." Jonas said, his voice rough. The Reverend died just before dawn, slipping away so quietly that Margaret didn't realize he was gone until she checked his breathing and found none. She sat with her hand on his cooling wrist, tears streaming down her face for this kind old man who'd ridden through hell to warn them and paid for it with his life. Jonas gently pulled her away from the body and held her while she cried. "He was a good man," he said quietly. "Better than most. He deserved better than dying on our floor." "He died trying to save us," Margaret said. "That's not nothing. That's noble." They wrapped Reverend Matthews's body in blankets and carried him to the barn, where the cold would preserve him until they could arrange proper burial. Then they returned to the cabin and sat at the table staring at each other with the weight of coming violence heavy between them. "We have maybe a week," Jonas said. "Maybe less if they're determined enough. We need to prepare." "How do you prepare for 3 killers?" "The same way you prepare for any threat. Make the ranch defensible. Set up warning systems, gather weapons and ammunition, and be ready to fight." Jonas's face was grim. "And we need to be smart about it. These men are professionals. They'll scout the ranch, look for weaknesses, try to catch us by surprise. Our advantage is that we know the terrain, and they don't. We use that." Over the next few days, they worked with grim determination to turn their home into a fortress. Jonas reinforced the cabin door, and shutters created firing positions at the windows and stockpiled ammunition. He taught Margaret how to properly aim and fire his rifle, making her practice until her shoulder ached from the recoil. "If it comes to shooting, don't hesitate," he instructed. "These men won't show you mercy just because you're a woman. They'll use any advantage they can get." Margaret's hands shook as she loaded the rifle, but her voice was steady. "I won't hesitate. I'll protect our home." Jonas also set up early warning systems, tripwires attached to bells, careful arrangements of branches that would show if someone had passed through vantage points where they could watch the main trail. He showed Margaret escape routes through the forest places to hide if things went badly. "I don't plan on running," Margaret said. "Plans change when bullets start flying. I need to know you can get away if necessary. And leave you. And survive. Someone needs to live to tell the story, to make sure people know these men were murderers, not lawmen." Jonas gripped her shoulders. "Promise me, Margaret. If it goes wrong, you run. You survive. You tell the truth about what happened here." Margaret wanted to refuse to insist they'd stand together no matter what. But she saw the desperation in Jonas's eyes and understood what he was really asking, that if he died, his sacrifice wouldn't be for nothing. That someone would remember he'd tried to be good. "I promise," she whispered. "But you have to promise to survive too, because I'm not raising our children alone." Jonas pulled her close. "I'll do everything I can to come back to you. But if—" "No." Margaret pressed her fingers to his lips. "No goodbyes. We're both surviving this. Both of us, or neither. That's the only acceptable outcome." They spent their nights planning and their days preparing, and through it all, they loved each other with an intensity born of knowing that time might be running out. Every touch was precious, every conversation weighted with the possibility of being the last. They made love desperately, gently, fiercely, each time a rebellion against the violence coming for them. A week after Reverend Matthew's death, on a day when the sun shone weakly through clearing clouds, Jonas was checking the perimeter when he returned to the cabin with his face pale. "They're here," he said. "Saw tracks on the north trail. Fresh ones. 3 horses, just like the Reverend said." Margaret's heart hammered, but her hands were steady as she checked the rifle. "What do? We wait. Let them come to us. The cabin gives us advantage stone walls, good firing positions, only one door to defend. Jonas loaded his own rifle with practiced efficiency. They'll probably try to talk first, feel us out. We don't engage unless we have to. But Margaret? I know, I'm ready. They didn't have to wait long. As the sun climbed toward noon, 3 men on horseback emerged from the tree line and stopped at the edge of the clearing. They made no move to approach, just sat their horses and studied the cabin. Jonas stepped out onto the porch, rifle held loosely but ready. That's far enough. State your business or move on. One of the men, a tall, lean figure with a face like chipped stone, nudged his horse forward a few steps. We're looking for Jonas Blackwood. You found him. Now what? Now we have a conversation about a man who died in Montana, a man whose family wants justice. I was cleared by the law. Justice was served. The stranger smiled, and it was the coldest expression Margaret had ever seen. The law and justice ain't always the same thing, Mr. Blackwood. Now we can do this easy, or we can do it hard. But either way, we're leaving here with what we came for. Then I guess it's going to be hard, Jonas said calmly. Because I'm not dying today, and I'm not letting you hurt my wife. So you have a choice right away now, and live or try your luck and see how many of you I can take down before you get me. The stranger's eyes flicked to the cabin windows, calculating. Margaret knew he was trying to determine if she was armed, if she'd fight, if she'd be a liability or a threat. Your wife, huh? The stranger's voice held dark amusement. Pretty little thing. Be a shame if she got caught in the crossfire. Jonas's rifle came up in a smooth motion, aimed directly at the stranger's chest. Threaten her again, and this conversation is over. The 3 men shifted uneasily. Whatever they'd expected, it wasn't this level of cold determination from their quarry. We're just doing a job, another man said, younger, nervous. Nothing personal. The money's good, and you're willing to murder an innocent man for it, Jonas finished. That makes you worse than me. At least when I killed, it was to protect someone. You're just doing it for profit. The 3 men exchanged glances. Then, without another word, they turned their horses and rode back into the trees. Margaret let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. They're leaving? No. Jonas kept his rifle trained on the tree line. They're regrouping. They'll come back after dark when they have the advantage. And this time they won't bother talking. He was right. As night fell and the temperature plummeted, Margaret and Jonas took up positions at the cabin windows, watching and waiting. The fire was banked low to avoid silhouetting them, and they'd laid out extra ammunition within easy reach. I love you, Margaret said into the darkness. I love you too, Jonas replied. And I'm sorry. Sorry that my past brought this to our door. Our door, Margaret corrected. Whatever happens now, we face it together. Outside, the night was silent, except for the wind. But somewhere in that darkness, 3 men were preparing to kill. And inside the cabin, 2 people who'd found unexpected love in the wilderness prepared to defend it with everything they had. The attack came just after midnight, brutal and coordinated, in a way that spoke of professional planning. The first gunshot shattered the window on the north side of the cabin, sending glass exploding inward. Margaret dove to the floor as Jonas returned fire, the muzzle flash lighting up the darkness for a split second. Another shot came from the west, then the south. They were surrounding the cabin, trying to pin them down from multiple angles. Stay low, Jonas shouted, moving to the east window to cover the one angle they hadn't been fired on from yet. They're trying to keep us from covering all sides at once. Margaret crawled to the broken north window, carefully raising her rifle above the sill and firing blindly into the darkness. She had no idea if she hit anything, but at least it would make them think twice about approaching from that direction. The gunfire was deafening in the small cabin, the smell of powder smoke burning her throat. Another window exploded as a bullet punched through the shutters, and Margaret felt splinters spray across her cheek. Blood trickled down her face, but she ignored it, focusing on reloading with shaking hands. They're trying to burn us out, Jonas yelled, and Margaret's heart lurched. Sure enough, orange light flickered at the corner of her vision. One of the attackers had thrown a torch onto the cabin roof. "What do we do?" Margaret's voice came out higher than she intended. "We go out the back. It's our only chance." Jonas fired twice more, then grabbed her arm. "On 3, we run for the barn. Ready." Margaret nodded, her mouth too dry to speak. 1, 2, 3. They burst through the back door into the freezing night. Immediately, gunfire erupted behind them. Margaret felt something tug at her skirt, a bullet passing so close it tore the fabric, but she kept running, Jonas's hand gripping hers like a vice. They made it to the barn and threw themselves inside. Jonas slammed the door and barricaded it with a heavy beam, while Margaret collapsed against a stall, gasping for air. "Are you hit?" Jonas demanded, his hands running over her arms and torso, checking for wounds. "No, I'm fine." Jonas moved to the barn's small window, peering out at the cabin. Flames were spreading across the roof now, bright against the black sky. Everything they owned was burning: their clothes, their food stores, the quilt Margaret had made, the Christmas tree that had marked their first real celebration together. Margaret felt tears sting her eyes, but she blinked them back furiously. They could mourn later. Right now, they had to survive. "They'll come for us here next," Jonas said grimly. "We can't stay. Need to get to the horses and run." But when they turned to the stalls, they found them empty. The horses were gone. The attackers must have released them earlier, cutting off their escape route. "Damn it!" Jonas slammed his fist against the wall. "They thought of everything." "So we go on foot." Margaret reloaded her rifle with steady hands despite the fear coursing through her. "We know these mountains. They don't. We can lose them in the forest." Jonas looked at her, and even in the dim light she could see the pride in his eyes. "You're sure?" "I'm sure. Now let's move before they decide to burn this building too." They slipped out the back of the barn into the trees, moving as quietly as possible through the snow. Behind them, the cabin burned like a beacon, and Margaret heard shouts as the attackers realized their quarry had escaped. They're heading for the ridge. Don't let them get away." Gunshots cracked through the night, bullets whipping past their heads and thunking into tree trunks. Margaret ran harder than she'd ever run in her life, her lungs burning in the frigid air, Jonas beside her matching her pace. They climbed through the forest, using trails Jonas had shown her during their preparations. The snow was deep and treacherous, and more than once Margaret stumbled, but Jonas was always there to catch her, to pull her up, to keep her moving. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit grew closer. The bounty hunters were younger and fresher than Jonas, and they were gaining ground. "Margaret!" Jonas gasped, his breath coming in ragged clouds. "Listen to me. There's a cave about half a mile ahead, just past the big split pine. You remember it?" "Yes, but you're going to hide there. I'm going to lead them away." "No!" Margaret grabbed his arm, forcing him to stop. "We stay together. That was the deal." "The deal changes when I can't protect you anymore." Jonas cupped her face in his hands, and Margaret realized he was crying. "I love you more than my own life, Margaret Blackwood. And because I love you, I need you to survive this. Please, go to the cave. Hide until dawn. Then make your way to town and tell them what happened here." "Jonas, no." "Yes." He kissed her hard, desperately. "I'll lead them away. Give you time to get clear. With luck, I'll lose them and circle back. But if I don't..." His voice broke. "If I don't, you tell our story. You tell everyone that we loved each other, that we built something good up here. You tell them I died protecting what mattered most." "I can't lose you," Margaret sobbed. "Please don't make me lose you." "You're not losing me. You're carrying me forward." Jonas pressed something into her hands, his mother's ring, the one Margaret had worn since Christmas. "Keep this safe. Give it to our daughter someday, and tell her about the man her father tried to be." Gunshots echoed closer now. Jonas gave Margaret one last kiss, then pushed her toward the cave trail. "Go now." Margaret ran, tears streaming down her face, every instinct screaming at her to turn back. Behind her, she heard Jonas shouting deliberately, drawing the hunters' attention. "Over here, you cowards! Come get me if you're brave enough!" More gunshots. A shout of pain, whether Jonas's or someone else's, Margaret couldn't tell. She wanted to stop to go back to die fighting beside her husband, rather than running like a coward. But she'd promised, and Jonas had asked her to survive to tell their story. So she ran. The cave was exactly where Jonas had said it would be, a narrow opening in the rocks that widened into a small chamber, barely large enough for one person. Margaret wedged herself into the deepest corner and pulled snow over the entrance to hide it, then sat in the darkness listening to the sounds of the hunt passing by above her. She heard gunfire sporadically through the night, heard shouts and curses as the hunters struggled through the deep snow. And then, just before dawn, she heard a scream, raw and agonized, and unmistakably, Jonas. Margaret bit her hand to keep from crying out, tasted blood as her teeth broke skin. The scream cut off abruptly, and the silence that followed was somehow worse than the sound had been. They'd caught him. They'd hurt him, and Margaret was hiding in a cave while her husband suffered. She started to crawl toward the cave entrance, ready to throw herself back into the fight, even if it meant dying. But then she heard voices right above her hiding spot. "That's the last of him. Bastard gave us more trouble than he was worth. At least we got him. $500 split 3 ways ain't bad for a week's work." What about the woman? Probably froze to death by now. These mountains don't forgive city girls. Let's get the body down to town, collect our money, and get out of this god-forsaken place. Their voices faded as they moved away. Margaret stayed frozen in her hiding place, her mind refusing to process what she'd heard. Jonas was dead. They'd killed him. And she'd hidden while it happened, just like he'd asked her to. She'd promised to survive, to tell their story. But sitting in that dark cave with the knowledge of Jonas's death crushing her chest, Margaret wanted nothing more than to walk out into the snow and let the cold take her too. But she didn't, because somewhere in the wreckage of her heart, a spark of fury was kindling. These men had murdered her husband for money, had destroyed their home and their future, and they thought they'd gotten away with it because she was just a weak city girl who'd freeze to death before she could cause trouble. They were wrong. Margaret waited until full daylight before leaving the cave. Her body was stiff with cold, her face crusted with frozen tears, but her mind was clear and focused. She had a purpose now, not just survival, but justice. She made her way back toward the ranch, moving carefully through the forest. When she finally emerged into the clearing where their cabin had stood, she had to stop and grip a tree for support. Nothing remained but smoking ruins. The cabin was gone, reduced to a blackened skeleton of beams and ash. The barn had been spared, but was clearly ransacked. And in the snow, near what had been their front door, Margaret saw blood, a trail of it leading away toward the main trail down the mountain. They'd dragged Jonas's body away like he was an animal, like his life had meant nothing. Margaret followed the blood trail with grim determination. If they'd taken Jonas to town to collect their bounty, then she'd go to town too. And she'd make sure everyone knew the truth about what had happened here. The trek down the mountain took hours. Margaret's legs shook with exhaustion, and more than once she had to stop and rest or risk collapsing. But she kept moving, driven by rage and grief and the promise she'd made to Jonas. She reached town just before dusk, stumbling down the main street like a ghost. People stared at her blood-streaked face and torn clothes, but Margaret ignored them. She headed straight for the sheriff's office. Sheriff Barrett looked up in shock as Margaret burst through his door. "Mrs. Blackwood, good God, what happened to you?" "They murdered my husband," Margaret said, her voice steady, despite the shaking in her hands. 3 bounty hunters. They came to our ranch last night, burned us out, and killed Jonas. They're probably here now, collecting their blood money, and I'm here to make sure they hang for it." The sheriff's face went pale. "Mrs. Blackwood, I think you should sit down." "I'll sit down when those men are in chains." Margaret slammed her hands on his desk. Jonas Blackwood was cleared by law in Montana. Those men murdered him for profit, And if you don't arrest them right now, I'll go to the territorial governor myself. I'll go to the newspapers. I'll make so much noise that every lawman in Colorado will know you let murderers walk free in your town." Sheriff Barrett stood slowly. The men who brought in Jonas's body said he was the aggressor, said he fired on them first, and they defended themselves. "They're liars." Margaret's voice could have cut steel. "They surrounded our home in the middle of the night and tried to burn us alive. We ran, and they hunted us through the forest like animals. I heard one of them scream after they caught Jonas. That's not self-defense, that's murder." "You have proof of this." "I'm the proof. I was there. I survived." Margaret met the sheriff's eyes unflinchingly. "And I'm not some hysterical woman making accusations. I'm a witness to murder, and I'm demanding you do your job." Something in her tone or her eyes must have convinced him. Sheriff Barrett grabbed his hat and gun belt. "They're at the saloon," he said. "Just collected their money an hour ago. Let's see what they have to say when confronted by the woman they thought was dead." The saloon fell silent when Margaret walked in, flanked by the sheriff. The three bounty hunters were at a corner table counting their money and drinking. They looked up at the commotion, and Margaret had the satisfaction of seeing genuine shock on their faces. "That's impossible," the tall one said, standing abruptly. "She couldn't have survived." "But I did," Margaret said coldly. "Survived to tell everyone what you really did. How you hunted us like animals. How you murdered my husband after he was wounded and helpless. How you burned our home to the ground and left me to die in the wilderness." "She's lying," the young one protested. "We were defending ourselves." "Then explain why you surrounded our cabin in the middle of the night," Margaret interrupted. "Explain why you threw torches on our roof. Explain why witnesses at the edge of town saw you releasing our horses hours before the attack to cut off our escape." This last was a bluff, but she delivered it with such conviction that doubt flickered across the sheriff's face. "Is this true?" Sheriff Barrett asked, his hand moving to his gun. The bounty hunters exchanged glances. The tall one's expression hardened. "Don't matter what she says. She's just a grieving widow. Nobody's going to believe her word over ours." "I will," said a new voice from the doorway. Mrs. Henderson pushed through the crowd, her face set with determination. "I know Margaret Blackwood. She's honest and true, and if she says you murdered her husband, then that's exactly what happened." "So will I," said another voice, the owner of the general store. "Jonas Blackwood was a good man who kept to himself and never caused trouble. If he's dead, it wasn't because he started a fight." One by one, townspeople stepped forward, their voices joining in support of Margaret. These were people who'd watched her and Jonas come to town for supplies, who'd seen how they looked at each other, who'd heard Reverend Matthews speak admiringly of their marriage. And while they might not have known Jonas well, they knew bounty hunters when they saw them. The sheriff drew his gun. "You three are under arrest for murder. You'll get a trial, but if what Mrs. Blackwood says is true, you'll hang for it." The tall bounty hunter's hand moved toward his gun, but Sheriff Barrett cocked his pistol with a loud click. "Don't," the sheriff said quietly. "You've already killed one good man. Don't make me kill you too." For a tense moment, violence hung in the air. Then slowly, the bounty hunters raised their hands in surrender. The trial took place 2 weeks later, and Margaret testified for 3 hours about everything that had happened that terrible night. She described their preparations, the siege, their desperate flight through the forest, and Jonas's final act of sacrifice. She spoke about the cave where she'd hidden, while listening to her husband die, and the voices of the hunters celebrating their kill. The defense tried to paint her as an unreliable witness, driven mad by grief and cold. But Margaret's testimony was too detailed, too consistent, too obviously true. And when the sheriff's investigation revealed that the bounty hunters had indeed released the Blackwood horses before the attack, the jury needed less than an hour to reach their verdict. Guilty of murder. All 3 of them. They were hanged on a cold February morning. Margaret watched from the crowd, her face impassive, even as the men who'd killed Jonas dropped through the gallows trapdoor. She felt no satisfaction in their deaths. It wouldn't bring Jonas back. But at least justice had been served. After the hanging, Mrs. Henderson invited Margaret to stay with her, but Margaret declined. "I'm going back to the ranch," she said. "But there's nothing left there." Mrs. Henderson protested. "The cabin burned. You'll freeze to death before spring." "Then I'll rebuild. Jonas and I built that ranch together, and I won't let it die just because he did." Margaret's voice was firm. "Besides, I made him a promise. I said I'd tell our story, and I did. Now I'm going to live it. For both of us." Mrs. Henderson tried to argue, but Margaret was immovable. She bought supplies with money the town had raised for her, borrowed a horse, and rode back up the mountain as soon as the trail was passable. The ranch was even more desolate than she remembered. Blackened ruins, scattered debris, and silence where there should have been life. Margaret stood in what had been their home and let herself cry, really cry, for the first time since Jonas's death. She cried for her husband, for their lost future, for the children they'd never have. When the tears finally stopped, Margaret wiped her eyes and got to work. She couldn't rebuild the cabin alone, but she could salvage what remained. She could repair the barn enough to shelter through what remained of winter. She could care for the animals that had wandered back. She could plant the garden come spring. She could survive. The work was brutally hard. Every day Margaret woke before dawn and worked until she collapsed at night. Her hands bled, her muscles screamed, and there were nights when she wasn't sure she'd wake up the next morning. But she kept going, driven by stubbornness and love, and the memory of Jonas telling her she was strong enough to survive anything. Spring came slowly, but it came. The snow melted, the trails cleared, and one morning, Margaret woke to find the first green shoots pushing up through the thawed earth. Life returning after winter's siege. Men from town began appearing, ranchers and farmers who'd known Jonas slightly and heard Margaret's story. They came bringing lumber and nails and strong backs, and together they raised a new cabin on the foundation of the old one. It was smaller and simpler than before, but it was solid and weatherproof and home. Mrs. Henderson came too, bringing seeds for the garden and chickens to replace the ones lost in the fire. "Jonas would want you taken care of," she said when Margaret tried to refuse. "Let his friends honor his memory by helping his widow." So Margaret let herself be helped. Let the community she and Jonas had barely been part of surround her with support and kindness. And slowly, painfully, she began to heal. She never remarried. Men came calling, occasionally widowers and bachelors who thought a young widow might need a husband. But Margaret always refused, gently but firmly. She'd had her great love, and it had been enough to last a lifetime. Instead, she poured herself into the ranch. She learned to break horses, to manage cattle, to handle every aspect of ranching that Jonas had planned to teach her. She became known throughout the territory as a skilled rancher and a woman who wouldn't be pushed around or taken advantage of. And she kept her promise to Jonas in other ways too. When travelers stopped at her ranch seeking shelter, she told them the story of Jonas Blackwood, the man who'd been driven from Montana for protecting the defenseless, who'd built a life in the wilderness, who'd loved his mail-order bride with unexpected depth, and who'd died defending her. She made sure everyone knew he'd been good and honorable and brave. 10 years after Jonas's death, a young woman showed up at Margaret's door. She was 19 or 20, with dark hair and frightened eyes, and bruises on her arms she tried to hide. "Mrs. Blackwood," she said hesitantly, I heard you help women who need help, women running from bad situations." Margaret studied the girl's face and saw herself at 17, desperate and scared, and hoping for a chance at something better. "Come inside," she said. "You're safe here." The girl's name was Emily, and she'd run from an abusive husband in Kansas. Over the following weeks, Margaret helped her file for divorce, taught her ranch work, and gave her the space to heal. When Emily was ready, Margaret helped her find work in town and start rebuilding her life. Emily wasn't the last. Word spread that Margaret Blackwood's ranch was a safe haven for women fleeing violence or poverty or impossible situations. Some stayed only long enough to catch their breath before moving on. Others stayed longer, learning skills that would help them survive independently. A few stayed permanently, becoming part of the chosen family Margaret built in the place where she and Jonas had dreamed of raising their children. Margaret never had biological children, but she had dozens of daughters, nonetheless women she helped, protected, and taught. She gave them what Jonas had given her, a chance to become something more than circumstances dictated. On the 20th anniversary of Jonas's death, Margaret made the long walk to the small cemetery where Reverend Matthews and Jonas were buried side by side. She'd kept her promise about naming a child Matthew or Grace. There was a young woman named Grace working at the ranch, now a girl Margaret had taken in 5 years ago, who'd become like a daughter to her. Margaret sat beside Jonas's grave and told him about everything that had happened, about the ranch thriving despite all odds, about the women she'd helped, about the life she'd built from the ashes of the one they'd planned together. "I miss you every day," she said softly. "But I'm not sorry for any of it. Not the hardship, not the pain, not even the way it ended. Because you gave me something I never expected to find. You gave me myself. And I've spent 20 years trying to give that gift to others." The wind rustled through the pines, and for just a moment, Margaret could almost feel Jonas beside her. Could almost hear his voice saying she'd done well, that he was proud that love like theirs didn't end just because one person died. Margaret stood brushing dirt from her skirt. She was 50 now, her hair streaked with gray and her hands permanently roughened by work. But she was strong and healthy and useful. And she was happy, not in the way she'd been happy with Jonas, but in a deeper, quieter way. The happiness of a life well lived, of promises, kept, of love honored through action. As she walked back to her ranch, Margaret thought about the frightened girl who'd climbed this mountain 20 years ago to marry a stranger. That girl had been looking for survival and found so much more. She'd found love and partnership and a strength she'd never known she possessed. And when that was taken from her, she'd found a way to keep living anyway, to keep loving anyway, to transform tragedy into purpose. The ranch came into view, and Margaret could see smoke rising from the chimney where Grace would be preparing dinner, could hear the lowing of cattle and the chatter of chickens and the sound of women's laughter from the barn, where 2 of the younger girls were finishing evening chores. This was her legacy. Not the children she and Jonas had planned, but something just as important. A place where broken women could learn to be whole. Where the vulnerable could find protection. Where the desperate could discover hope. Margaret Blackwood had come to Colorado as a mail-order bride seeking escape. She'd found love, lost it, and rebuilt herself into something stronger than she'd ever imagined possible. And in doing so, she'd created something that would outlast any single lifetime, a testament to the truth that love once given never really dies. It just changes form, spreading outward in circles that touch lives in ways we can't predict. Jonas had asked her to survive and tell their story. Margaret had done that, and more. She'd lived their story forward, turning personal tragedy into collective healing, private grief into public good. And somewhere in that transformation, she'd discovered the deepest truth of love, that its power isn't measured by how long 2 people have together, but by what they build in each other that continues after they're apart. The sun set behind the peaks as Margaret reached her door, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. She paused on the threshold, looking back at the mountains that had witnessed so much joy and sorrow, and felt at peace. Jonas's spirit lived on in every woman she'd helped, in every skill she'd taught, in every act of protection she'd provided. Their love, born from necessity, deepened through hardship, and sealed in sacrifice, had become something bigger than either of them. It had become a legacy of hope and strength and second chances that would ripple forward long after Margaret herself was gone. And that was worth more than any fairy tale ending could ever be.